Okay, we're going to get started up again for our final research session. So if you can all come back to your seats. So one of the things that Jenny and I talked about earlier today is the breadth of people represented in the room here. And you've had a chance to hear from some of the most senior scholars in our field, in the field of organizational research. And culture research, scholars that many of us read about in our doctoral programs who were required reading on various reading lists. But we're now going to have a final session which really is going to feature two rising stars in our field. And it's my pleasure to introduce both of them. Arianna Marchetti from INSEAD, who is finishing her PhD this year and is going to be joining the faculty of London Business School. And Anjali Bhatt, who's at Stanford's Business School right now, and will be joining the faculty at HBS. And then I will have a few discussant comments at the end, and we'll have another Q&A following that. So, Arianna.
Thank you very much for the very kind introduction and for having us here. My name is Arianna, and as Samir was saying, I'm finishing my PhD in strategy at INSEAD. And today I will present a co-authored piece with Panish Puranam, in which we are investigating this substitution effect between culture and organizational structure. So we know that this substitution is at stake, but we want to understand better what kind of organizational typologies can favor certain types of organizing, in particular in what we call flat organizations. So we have been exploring this idea of substitution between culture and organizational structure, looking at what we call less hierarchical firms. So those are organizations of the sort you see on this chart, and I just realized that some of them are featured here, so I became all self-conscious. I'll move fast here. Those are basically organizations that over time have proactively decided to reduce their reliance on formal hierarchy and authority in the way they get things done. So our question is mostly to understand whether these less hierarchical firms, which we will call LH in the rest of the presentation, exhibit any specific cultural features that allow them to reduce their reliance on formal hierarchy and authority in the way they get things done. And if the answer to this question is yes, we would also like to understand how managers can achieve these cultural configurations that can help these organizations to spur coordination and collaboration. For what we understood reading a lot of the business press, these less hierarchical firms are a very special animal and are also very elusive. It has been very hard to try to get a grasp of these organizations and gather data on how these firms function internally. So we're hoping to crack this problem leveraging, I'm a bit confused with the clicker. Leveraging a secondary data source from Glassdoor, basically using text reviews that employees post online about what they like and what they don't like about their organization. I will explain, I'm guessing most of you are familiar with Glassdoor, but it's basically what I call the TripAdvisor for organizations. Here is where people go online and write what they like and what they don't like about these firms. So we'll basically show how to leverage about 170,000 text reviews and applying some machine learning tools to understand topics and values that people within these less hierarchical organizations are talking about and understand their cultural configurations to also figure out whether those are systematically different than traditional hierarchies. So basically we'll build a matching sample where we will look at organizations that still adopt traditional hierarchy in the way they get things done, but are comparable over a bunch of variables to the less hierarchical firms we feature in this study. And we will try to understand whether their cultural configurations are significantly different. Finally, we will also use predictions from agent-based simulation modeling to try to understand how managers can build these cultural configurations that we observe. All right, we have heard a lot about organizational culture, many different definitions. One thing is that we haven't agreed on what organizational culture is, so I'll give you one new definition again. One thing that we have probably realized so far is that we have at least agreed to the extent of saying that the culture of a group can be described by the extent to which the individuals belonging to the group share similar and deeply held cognitive constructs among each other. These cognitive constructs can be in the forms of values, norms, beliefs, or frames. So the specific definition we will use in this project to understand organizational culture is the one of cultural frames. So a cultural frame will help us for each single person to understand how these people living in the organization ascribe importance to a set of contextual attributes that can be used to describe the firm. So to be slightly less abstract, this graph here is an example of the cultural frame of a person living within a firm that can be described by these 5 contextual attributes you have here. And as you see, this chart is telling us that this person has a finite mind share, but is ascribing importance to these different contextual attributes in a way that not all of them are equally important for the person. So basically, what we are saying is that we'll start by looking at the shapes of the cultural frames of each and every person belonging to the organization, and we'll aggregate them by basically by comparing the shapes of these distributions and describing the culture of the whole group by using 2 distributional properties. We'll talk about the similarity of the people within the organization by basically trying to understand to what extent the people of the firm consider the same attributes of the organization as important to them. So very simply, if we are to contrast Organization 1 and Organization 2, each having 3 individuals with their own cultural frames, you can see very easily that it seems that people in Organization 1 have much higher similarity in their preference over the characteristics of the firm than in Organization 2. So similarity would be higher in our language in this group than in the other. The second property we explore is the one of focus. So we think that similarity among individuals is not enough to understand characteristics of organizational culture, and focus can add something important and interesting. Basically, focus is telling us whether people in the organization have preferences for few or many attributes of the organization itself. So basically, it's telling us whether the frames are spiky vectors, as in this case, rather than flat vectors, as in this other case. And again, very intuitively, in this case, the focus of Organization 1 will be higher than Organization 2. Now, I will use these 2 ideas of cultural similarity and focus to get at a construct that we have heard a lot today: cultural strength. Here again, this is a very contested theoretical construct, and I'll try to build on what I've seen so far and measuring it somehow in a way that can be helpful for organizations. So we define cultural strength as the product of similarity and focus. And so a strong culture is a culture in which individuals consider the same and few attributes of the organization as important to them. So a strong culture would basically look like something like this. It's a culture where people have peaks in their preferences. They're not kind of like flatly interested in pretty much all the attributes of the firm, but they have strong stands about things that matter. And these things that matter to them happen to be the same. This is very important. So they have spikes in the same positions about the attributes of the organization. Now, why do I make a big deal about these strong cultures? Is because we believe that I think I'm going backward instead. No. Sorry. No. I sent the wrong version of the presentation. Okay, why do I make a big deal about these strong cultures? Is because we believe that by creating these overlapping focal points among people, those enable coordination of the agents. Basically, these people kind of know each other very well, and they will be able to coordinate and collaborate very easily. So how do I use this idea of strong culture to understand the functioning of less hierarchical firms? we build basically on the findings of prior literature that says that hierarchy and culture should exhibit a substitution effect. But scholars haven't really gotten into specific details about what it means and what kind of cultural forms exhibit a substitution effect with hierarchy. And we also know from a theoretical standpoint that this flatter organization should exhibit higher internal congruence over common values and beliefs. So what we're doing here is basically to take this sort of like loose evidence from past research and reformulate it in a stronger way using our definition of strong cultures, and saying that if less hierarchical organizations take out the hierarchy from their way they're functioning, their way to achieve coordination should be through stronger cultures compared to traditional firms. Now, this is the first step. Okay, we're trying to prove that there exists a systematic difference between less hierarchical and traditional firms in their cultures, and these strong cultures sustain certain ways of getting things done. But then the next question is, how do managers can achieve these stronger cultures? So what we do as a next step is to basically use an agent-based simulation model to generate predictions about how managers can create certain types of cultures. So what we do is to model very simply an organization as a bunch of people that come in with their own preferences about attributes of the firm that they believe being important. And also, we consider the existence of what we call the frame of the organization, if you will, the espoused values from the top management team that are kind of like superimposed, the identity that you hear, the mission values, the statements that you hear when you join an organization. And at every point in time, there is two different types of interactions, pretty much. There is what we call a peer-to-peer socialization, sense-making process in which people meet each other and learn what are the preferences over these attributes of their colleagues, and kind of update their preferences because they might find interesting the perspective of the other people in the organization. And then there is also a top-down asymmetric kind of process in which, through training, for instance, managers tell you these are the values that we want to pursue. And we have been hearing this quite a lot today. It's like top-down versus bottom-up approach to build cultures and preferences. So what we did was to simulate this type of interactions over time and try to observe what kind of cultural structures would emerge at the end of the days. We find something quite interesting. So basically, if you just allow people to interact in a peer-to-peer fashion with their colleagues without imposing any asymmetric process from the top, you would observe what we call a frame dilution. Basically, by talking with each other, people become more and more similar. The similarity of their frames increases, but they lose their focus. Basically, they kind of like don't have these spikes in their preferences anymore. And the only way to prevent this frame dilution effect is basically through favoring either sorting in and out of the right type of people or imposing a very strong top-down socialization process that kind of preserves the identity and the value of the organization. So as a follow-up, we believe that if less hierarchical firms are able to create these stronger cultures, they should exhibit less frame dilution than the traditional firms. Now, how do we measure organizational culture? As I was mentioning, we use Glassdoor data for doing this. Glassdoor is this website on which people can go and share what they like and what they don't like about their organization. And we take about 170,000 text reviews to feed them into a machine learning algorithm and trying to understand what kind of topics people are talking about. So briefly about the data generation process, let's say there is an employee that goes online and wants to share a text review on Glassdoor. This person will first ask themselves, which are the topics that matter to me that I want to share with other people that will come on the platform? And second, which words I want to use to talk about each and every of the topics I've selected. And then the person finally posts the review online. So what we did here was, for each and every firm in our sample, collect all the text reviews that employees have written on Glassdoor over about 12 years, and feed them to an algorithm for topic modeling, which basically tries to identify topics that people discuss in a large corpus of text. So the algorithm will give us two outputs. The first one is which topics people are talking about across all the reviews of the specific firm. And the second is for every review, which percentage of the review is covering each of the identified topics. And this is pretty nice because in our theoretical world, the topics are basically the contextual attributes that people use to make sense of their reality, and the distribution of reviews over topics are an empirical estimation of their preferences. It's like to what extent people prefer one topic, the other, many versus few. And we use these to basically understand the extent of cultural similarity and focus, and therefore cultural strength of these firms. Who are the firms in our sample? This was the biggest challenge, and I had the pleasure of collecting them by hand. So, of course, there is no data set that would tell you these firms is not hierarchical, doesn't use any formal authority. So basically what we did was to screen all the academic and practitioner-oriented sources and try to compile a list of all the firms that appeared in this paper that were mentioned as reducing their reliance on hierarchy. And then the next step would be to identify matching firms. So firms that look comparable to the less hierarchical firms over a bunch of information, age, size, revenue, industry, country of incorporation, and ownership structure, but that still use traditional hierarchy as their main way of organizing. And this left us with a final sample with a lot of sweat and tears of 46 less hierarchical firms and 48 traditional firms, and about 170,000 text reviews from Glassdoor that we could feed into our machine learning algorithm. What we find is, sorry, I couldn't refrain from putting some ugly tables here, is that H1 is about trying to understand whether, in fact, culture and hierarchy are substitutes. And the idea, in fact, is that when we measure cultural strength the way I described before with Glassdoor data, we find that less hierarchical firms seem to exhibit stronger cultures than traditional firms. So cultures in which people care for similar and few contextual attributes of their firms. And then, where do these strong cultures come from? I'll skip this in the interest of time. Basically, the idea is that these strong cultures can come either from sorting of employees or socialization. And we give a proof that the strong cultures that we observe come from the sorting of the right employees. We show sorting on entry and sorting on exit. So for sorting on entrance, we are showing that basically the reported cultural fit of these people within the organization that we measure as well from Glassdoor doesn't increase with the tenure of the people, meaning that the firm is already very good when hiring to select people that perceive themselves as good cultural fit. And the second, the proof for sorting on exit, we show it by demonstrating that people that leave, the former employees that post on Glassdoor, have lower reported cultural fit than the people that stay. So to wrap it up, we're finding that, yes, strong cultures are a substitute for hierarchy. So this is a way for firms to get things done. And firms can achieve these strong cultures by sorting the people within and outside the firm rather than changing their mental frames. So I guess this is a bad news for the managers in the room today. You can't really shift. If you're planning to move from a structured hierarchy to a flatter organization, you cannot really achieve a supporting culture by just changing the frames of the people you have, but you have to inject some fresher blood in terms of trying to hire the people that would be a good fit with the culture you're trying to build. And for the academic audience, this is pretty much, in terms of organization design, I think this is the first larger scale sample of flatter organization in which we are demonstrating this substitution effect between hierarchy and culture, and showing that selection matters more than socialization to achieve these sort of cultural configurations. And with this, thank you so much. It's a weird thing.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Anjali Bhatt. I'm really thrilled to be here. I'm very excited to present to you some work that I did as part of my dissertation that I think touches on a lot of what we've been talking about today and yesterday. I think can we go back? some more back. All right. Okay, we're good. All right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about mergers and culture, which I think has come up a lot today. And I'll start with the example that I think a lot of us are familiar with. This is the infamous merger between Daimler and Chrysler, two automotive giants, in 1998. Infamous because it was a cultural disaster. It was an integration of two companies that had very different ways of behaving, very different cultures. Can we? No. All right. And so this difference in cultures is summarized really nicely in this book that a couple of journalists wrote a few years after the merger, where they said, the great divide between the Germans and Americans seemed as deep as it was wide. They didn't just make cars differently. They lived in separate worlds. And so underpinning this quote is this theory that I think a lot of us have, and a lot of folks who have researched cultural integration post-merger, that cultural differences between organizations, I mean, not just national differences, but really organizational cultures and their differences, have a tremendous impact on post-merger performance. And we've heard about this in a variety of ways, not just mergers, but also I think the conversation that Jenna Lee was talking about with two different parts of Netflix having very different cultures and how you get those to work together. And so there's been a wide variety of academic research on this topic of if two organizations have different cultures, how do you get them to work together, or how can you predict whether or not the merger is going to be successful? But the quote continues, and it actually talks about something a little bit different. Bringing them together required changes in behavior and a willingness to accept the other side's cultural biases. So implicit here is this idea that actually maybe these cultural differences can be overcome if only individuals are willing to do things a little bit differently, if they're willing to adapt. And the book gives an example of two different individuals, two different executives at Chrysler who behaved, who adapted very differently to the merger. On the one hand was Tom Stallkamp, who spent more time defending the Chrysler way to his people than promoting the integration. And on the other hand was Jim Holden, who was as ready with a backslap as a serious answer on V6 engines. He had what the Germans called an open personality. And so I'm trying to understand and make a little bit of progress on exactly this issue in this project, which is why do different individuals adapt so differently in terms of their cultural behaviors following a merger? What explains variation in how individuals culturally adapt following a merger? And this question is actually really hard to think about and to address empirically, in part because we have a data problem. In order to answer this question, we need information about the culture at the organizational level, the organizations involved, and then we also need to understand how individuals over time adapt their behavior with respect to those organizational cultures. And so part of why I'm really excited about this is I think we have a little bit of a solution to this data problem. What I'm going to be using is language used in about 1.5 million emails between employees pre and post merger. And I'm going to apply text analysis as well as machine learning, supplemented with personnel records and employee interviews to try and get a little bit of headway on this question. So I'm going to focus on culture. I mean, we've talked about a lot of different definitions of culture already, but I'm going to focus on culture at the sort of behaviors and symbol level, and specifically individual short-term changes. And so I'm going to think about this borrowing a construct that a lot of other folks have written about, which is cultural code switching. So how individuals move between different systems or codes of behavior. In this case, one's in-group or legacy organization's cultural code and one's out-group or partner organization's cultural code. And so that's the way I'm going to ask this question, which is who switches cultural codes following a merger? And to answer this, I'm going to think about this with two important components, that individuals are going to switch cultural codes if they have both the motivation and the ability to do so. And there are a lot of different ways that I can conceptualize motivation and ability, but with motivation, I'm going to focus on how individuals manage status hierarchies, and with ability, I'm going to focus on how individuals learn cultural codes. And I'll talk through each in turn. So why status hierarchies? Why are we thinking about status during a merger? Well, actually, at its core, a merger threatens status hierarchy. In a strict social sense, a merger constitutes a situation in which you're destabilizing the boundaries between two social groups. And so what that means is when you put two social groups together and you've destabilized that boundary, you're threatening both the between-group status hierarchy. If one organization is higher status than the other, then that becomes less salient when the social boundary is blurred. But also the within-group status hierarchy. If each organization has its own social order and way of rewarding and promoting individuals, those two become in competition with one another. And so it's not clear what the status ordering of individuals is going to be in the newly merged organization. Well, how do individuals respond to status threats? How do individuals think about managing their status? One primary way that we know from sociological literature is that individuals use cultural boundary work in particular, to manage their status. There's a wide variety of literature in sociology that looks at how cultural boundary work, which is this idea that you might create distinctions between groups, for example, here the symbol of being a red circle versus a green star, that being a really important way in which you can reinforce boundaries that then allow the social order to perpetuate. And so we might imagine that it seems rather intuitive then that high-status individuals are going to want to reinforce those social boundaries and preserve the status hierarchies as they exist, whereas low-status individuals are going to want to blur those boundaries so that they can enable mobility and they have chances to move up the status hierarchy. So if we think about cultural code switching as an example of blurring that boundary between the two social groups, we might predict that for both the between group and the within group dimensions of status, we're going to see low status individuals engaging in more cultural code switching post-merger than high status individuals. Well, what about ability? What we know is that individuals actually have tremendous variation in how they enact cultural codes. And to Jeremiah's point earlier, that individuals are different in terms of how adaptable they are to new organizational cultures. And so we might expect that individuals have different kind of adaptability in this post-merger context as well. And most recently, we have empirical research that suggests that what this adaptability represents is individuals' capacity to perceive differences between organizational cultures and then adjust their behavior accordingly. I might be different from the organization, or one organization might be different from another, and so I need to adjust my behavior in some important way. But in the context when we have two organizational cultural codes, as in a merger, individuals might be motivated to adapt or conform to either. And so actually here we might think that then low status individuals and high status individuals who are adaptable might behave differently. On the one hand, we might expect that for low status individuals, greater adaptability is associated with more blurring of social boundaries, more cultural code switching. Whereas for high status individuals, we might expect that greater adaptability actually enables them to not only perceive the differences between the two organizational cultural codes, but actually resist that cultural blending more effectively and culturally code switch even less. So this is the basis of sort of the hypotheses that I'd like to test. And the empirical setting in which I'm going to look at this is a real merger a couple years ago between two mid-sized U.S. regional banks that I'm going to very creatively call Bank 1 and Bank 2. And as I mentioned before, the data that I have consists of about 1.5 million internal emails before and after the merger. And what I have from these emails are a set of linguistic features in the emails, as well as metadata associated with the time of when messages were sent. I don't have any actual data on the specific individual employees. It's all anonymized. And I also have information on sort of the department and the rank of individuals, their performance, as well as some information from semi-structured interviews that helps me get a sense of what kind of a merger this really was. Mergers come in all sorts of different sizes and flavors. And there's some real key advantages to this specific context that make studying the question of cultural adaptability and differences there really, really good. So first, the two organizations had very different cultures prior to the merger. They actually thought they had very similar cultures, but on the one hand, we had Bank 1, that was a 15-year-old urban, more entrepreneurial bank, and Bank 2 was about a 120-year-old, more rural, more bureaucratic bank. And so there was a real need, actually, to integrate or to culturally adapt. And yet individuals didn't actually expect that they would need to adapt. So there was no pre-merger adaptation. The individuals felt, most employees felt, that these two banks actually had very similar organizational cultures in their mind because they were not big bank. They were not Wells Fargo, Bank of America. They were very, in their minds, they thought that things were going to be exactly the same. And in fact, because the two organizations were of similar sizes, there was also a sense that there were no differences in status between the two organizations. There was no incumbent and acquirer difference. It was branded as a merger of equals. But in the end, what actually happened is that Bank 2 CEO ended up in a scandal of sorts. And unlike, or very similar to a lot of mergers that we know, it was branded as a merger of equals, it ended up actually as an acquisition. And so Bank 2 individuals ended up with less social capital in the merged organization, with less sense of what's really going on. And so that created this clear difference between the two groups in terms of the status hierarchy. Bank 1 individuals sort of saw themselves as higher status than Bank 2 individuals. And that's another clear advantage of this setting, which is that in addition to having this difference between what ended up being incumbent versus acquired status, there are also a number of dimensions on which I can look at within group, within organization status as well. And finally, individuals really varied in how they adapted following the merger. Some individuals felt like the merger was a real, like it was a really difficult time to think about cultural differences and how to understand other folks, whereas other individuals felt like things weren't that different. They were easy to fit in. And so this makes it a really interesting setting in which to understand how do individuals actually adapt and how do they vary in their adaptation. So as I mentioned, I measure status in a couple of different ways, and that makes this setting really, really nice for looking at different status hierarchies. For my measure of between group status, I look at individuals who are incumbent employees from Bank 1 versus acquired employees in Bank 2. For within group status, I look at three different measures. I look at their formal rank based on their job title, whether they're managers versus lower level employees. I also look at their informal influence in the network, in the email network. And finally, their achieved performance based on their performance ratings pre-merger. But the key here really is, how do I measure culture? How do I measure these ideas of adaptability and code switching? And for that, I think we've heard a little bit about this before, but I'm using language as a behavioral manifestation of culture that we can trace, which is really exciting to me. I'm specifically going to use the linguistic style in email communication, which Shamir and others have used. And I'll focus on 57 features from the 2007 Luke Dictionary. So just to give you an example of what this is, the Luke Dictionary consists of 57 features that are things like pronouns, emotions, cognitive categories like space and time, those types of words that are used in emails. And so what I do is I take each email in my corpus and I map it to a 57-dimensional vector of counts associated with each of these linguistic categories. From there, what I'm trying to do is then map, as I mentioned, the linguistic style of each email to get a sense of the cultural codes at the organizational level, and then how, at the individual levels, how much they code switch, which I measure based on how much their emails map the outgroup, the other organization's cultural code following the merger, as well as their adaptability, which I measure based on their pre-merger emails, how much they conform to their in-group's cultural code, their legacy organization's cultural code. So you can imagine all the emails that I have, and I'm trying to get these measures together. So you can divide them into emails sent pre-merger, post-merger, sent within the organization versus between the two organizations. And first what I do is I take a subset of the emails sent within the groups, and I use that to establish what the organization level cultural codes are. And then using that, I'm able to apply those measures of what the cultural codes are to get a sense of pre-merger, how adaptable individuals are, and post-merger, how much they code switch. The key here, though, is how do I go from the linguistic style to the organizational level cultural codes? And one of the things that a lot of older research and very rich ethnographic and qualitative research on organizational culture has suggested is that there's a lot of variation within organizations. There are a lot of subcultures. There are a lot of different potential prototypical linguistic styles. And so a lot of conventional measures for thinking about mapping a linguistic style or different linguistic features to one cultural code might make assumptions about there being no heterogeneity, no variation within organizations. And so the way I overcome that is by using a machine learning model, specifically a random forest algorithm, to try and allow for there to be variation within organizations, but still capture what is different about each organizational cultural code. And I'm happy to talk more about this offline. So having done that, I basically use two different algorithms pre and post merger. And I train data I use a training data set for each to establish each algorithm. That gives me the cultural code at the organizational level. Then I can apply that at the individual level and get my measures of pre-merger in-group conformity or adaptability and post-merger code switching. And so just to give you a preview of the results, happy to talk more about these later. Remember, my predictions are that there's a difference between how much individuals who are low status and high status code switch, but also that differs based on how adaptable they are. First, I look at this based on their between group status. So this is acquired versus incumbent employees. And I see this sort of consistent effect that the lower status acquired individuals are both more likely to culturally code switch than the high status individuals, the incumbent employees, but also that the more adaptable they are, the even more likely that the low status acquired individuals are to code switch. And we see this negative relationship for the incumbent individuals. We can also look at this using the within-group status measures. So here we have title-based status, informal network centrality, and prior performance. And we see exactly the same relationship, that for low-status individuals, adaptability is associated with more cultural code switching, but for high-status individuals, adaptability is associated with less cultural code switching. I can go through a bunch of robustness checks, but I'll skip that for time. So just to conclude, I think there are a couple of different contributions of this study, and just starting to even unpack how individuals vary and how they adapt post-merger. In some ways, this is actually one of the first studies that is able to disentangle individual-level post-merger cultural behavior over time. And using this machine learning approach is starting to get at some of the variation that happens within organizations in the cultural behavior. Theoretically, I think we have some interesting contributions to what's happening with how within group status and cultural boundary work are related to one another. But I think what I really want to highlight is that we tend to think about adaptability as this really good thing. The more adaptable an individual is, the more they're going to help cultural change initiatives or cultural integration. Here, what I'm finding is that adaptability can both lead to this integration and code switching, but it can also lead individuals to resist and to polarize. And so we really need to think a little bit more about how we can manage adaptability in individuals. And finally, for practice, we know that mergers and acquisitions are not simply a question of when we should merge and acquire, but also how do we successfully integrate. And so I really want to think a little bit more about how can we then, given what we know about how individuals culturally adapt, how can we help manage mergers and acquisitions rather than simply decide whether or not two organizations can merge? I think this also has interesting applications beyond mergers to thinking about team restructuring or cross-cultural differences, alliances and partnerships. And so happy to think through some of these things offline. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm going to ask both Arianna and Anjali to come back up on the stage. And as they do, I want to just make a few quick remarks about the sociological perspective on organizations. You heard earlier from Jenny and from Todd about the social psychological and economic perspectives. And if you look at this slide, you'll see, again, quite a bit of overlap. And that's because these disciplines are thinking about some of the same things, but there are also some different things that get emphasized in each disciplinary perspective. In the sociological perspective, as we saw in Anjali's talk, there's a lot of attention paid to how individuals perceive or fail to perceive the social rules by which a group operates. And there's a lot of focus, less on culture as values, but more on culture that's manifested in behavior, both the intentional and deliberative forms of behavior, but also the habitual behavior that leads to a performance for a given audience. And then there's a question about how those audiences are going to respond or fail to respond to that performance and the consequences of that for individuals, groups, and the organization as a whole. In Arianna's paper, we see a really nice example of point number 4, which is that the distribution of culture in a social group can also be really consequential for outcomes and can matter independent of what the specific cultural norms are. So if you notice in her study, she wasn't thinking about a culture of adaptability or innovation. It was about whatever the norms are, how are they distributed? Right? And there's signal to be extracted from that distributional approach to culture in addition to more of a normative content-based approach. So with that, I want to open it up to questions. Why don't we start with one from the crowd right now, and then we'll turn to Pigeonhole next. Morton.
Yeah, two really nice studies. I have a question for you regarding the high-status individuals. I'm a little, I wonder if in a merger or acquisition, isn't it, if you're high status, say you're head of HR in both of these, I guess you're high status by the rank at least. Wouldn't you say, well, if I am winning, right, I become the new joint head. That's when I'm going to be more adaptable. That's when I'm going to be more open. That's when I'm going to be that Chrysler executive who's welcoming the other culture. But if I'm losing, I'm the head who gets demoted, then I would have all these attributes that you were talking about. So did you sort of think about the rank post-merger as a way of thinking about whether I'm going to be more adaptable or not?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. In this example, what I'm measuring is individuals' status before the merger based on their pre-merger job title. And so I actually I haven't compared it to their post-merger job title. But that would be interesting if you see folks that are demoted versus promoted. I think I would expect things consistent with what you're saying, which is that if you're promoted, then you might be more inclined to adapt and accommodate. Versus if you're demoted, you're more resistant. I haven't looked at that, though. Great point.
Next question is for Arianna. So could you say a little bit more about the role of selection in shaping the culture? How were you able to rule out that it wasn't socialization? Why did you come to that conclusion?
So basically, the part I skipped is about this idea that we observe in both the less hierarchical and the new form and the traditional hierarchies, we observe what we call frame dilution, which means that the socialization mechanisms are strongly at stake in both cases. But simultaneously, if we observe that the new forms have stronger cultures, it means that the new forms have some mechanisms at stake that can counteract this peer-to-peer socialization effect of frame dilution. And this has to be either sorting or top-down, and we show that it's sorting through the two tests that I provided here. So basically, I skipped the part of showing that the cultural frame effect is at stake in both the new forms and the traditional hierarchies, meaning that therefore the new forms have to have some counter-acting mechanism to favor these stronger cultures that we observe.
Question for both of you, which is both of you have focused on culture as manifested in language. And one question that comes up is that just a superficial form of culture? Is it a meaningful form of culture? Thoughts?
I think it's a very valid point, and I heard this pushback many times. I gave talks using this data. Is basically what I'm able to observe is not the deep ingrained values and norms that are taken for granted by people, because if those are taken for granted, people don't feel the need, at least in my context, to go online and share those on Glassdoor. So yeah, I think it's a fair point. I'm observing more those controversial aspects of the culture that people still feel the need to share in the form of a pros or cons of their organization. Since I'm interested in understanding how certain cultural structures can favor coordination, I believe that the taken for granted values are not a problem there, because people just get along on those dimensions, and so those are not an issue for coordination. But yeah, that's a very fair point, and I think language enables us to study some parts of our culture, and then there is many other tools that we could apply to look at other aspects.
Yeah, no, I think that, as I mentioned early on, that I'm focused on cultural change at the behavioral and symbolic level, and that's why I'm looking at email language. And I don't know that I can make conclusions about what's happening in terms of individuals' values or beliefs or underlying mental models. But at the same time, I think that these kinds of behavioral changes do matter in organizations, and there are reasons to think that if you change, I think somebody mentioned earlier today that if you change people's behaviors and habits, that's one way in which things can kind of bubble up to the level of norms or values or beliefs. It'd be interesting. I mean, I don't have any way of measuring the kind of underlying things, but it'd be interesting to see if we see faster change. I mean, I would expect that emo language is a pretty low-cost behavior to change, and so we might see adaptation there more quickly than other things. And so there's more kind of signal there that we can measure and see, okay, there's variance in how individuals behave. I don't know how long it would take, and obviously there are difficulties in collecting data longitudinally with these kind of underlying beliefs and mental models, and I think a lot of folks around here and elsewhere are kind of innovating methods to get at that. But if we could compare the two, I think that would be really fascinating, actually.
Time for one last question. Let's make it a live question. Rich.
I guess this question could be for either of you, and thanks for those talks. It's just great work, but maybe more for you, Anjali. We're starting to hear more and more from practitioners about the notion of hiring for enculturability per se, right, as opposed to does this person fit, does this person not fit? And your work obviously speaks to that to some degree. So maybe just a couple of comments on sort of a company that's trying to hire more for enculturability. What might you recommend?
Yeah, I think I was sort of... it gave me pause to think about how these results might influence, recommendations for practice, because all of a sudden what this suggests is that enculturability is kind of a double-edged sword, that sometimes it's really great because it means that folks will drink the Kool-Aid and buy into the way things are done, and that's, they're plug and play, so to speak, in some ways. But I think what we're also seeing here is that individuals who are adaptable are also... underlying that adaptability is this skill at differentiating cultures and being dexterous with culture, and that dexterity can be a force for polarization or for the formation of subcultures of resistance or something that could be really. I guess I'm thinking about it in a negative way, but maybe there are ways in which that's positive for increasing diversity of cultural and cognitive ideas in an organization. So I think we need to move away from purely thinking about adaptability or enculturability as something that's about convergence, and maybe also thinking about that individual attribute as something that could create divergence. And we have yet to explore, I think, a little more about under what conditions do we see that divergence.
Terrific. Thank you. Please join me in thanking both Anjali and Arianna.